Hey y'all, this is Raven Rizzo's, and this is another flight attendant video. But I wanted to make this video because I know some of y'all have questions about things that have to do with getting into this industry or just questions about the job. And I'm going to make future videos about them, but please understand that sometimes my time is limited, so I can't pump out videos like I want to. However, this particular video, I wanted to talk about some mistakes that people make during the flight attendant interview process, including myself. You know, I'm not leaving myself out of this. I did not have perfect experiences where everything was flawless. Believe it or not, I had to go to 3 different flight attendant interviews before I got the job. So with that being said, let me get into some mistakes that people make at flight attendant interviews. So I'm going to start with one that a lot of y'all know to do, but this is very crucial, and that is to be on time. And being late is a mistake that many candidates make. If it starts at 8 o'clock, don't get there at 7:59. Whether you're invited to it or it's an open house, get to it early. You know, get there 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes early if you can. Because think about it. It's not just, okay, I get there at 7:55. No, you have to make sure you find the room that the interview is being held in. You want to make sure you get a good seat. You want to make sure that the recruiters get a chance to meet you and see that you're prompt and that you make a good first impression, and not that you're sliding through the door at, a minute before it's time to start the interview process, or that you're getting there right at, the time the door closes. That just, it's not a good first impression. A mistake that candidates make during this process is their appearance. I'm not saying you have to be model perfect and you have to have a suit or a 3-piece suit from Nordstrom or Saks Fifth Avenue. I'm just saying to make sure that whatever you have, it looks its very best. If you have a top, make sure it's ironed. If you have a blazer, make sure it's not smelly. If you're wearing a skirt, make sure it's not all the way up to your thigh. This is a time to shine. This is not a time to, slack off in your appearance. I'm not saying appearance is everything, but it does show the recruiters that, okay, we can rely on her to look presentable, or we can rely on him to look neat and presentable and follow our dress code. So once the recruiter has come into the room, introduced themselves, and told you about how the day is going to go, given you some information about the company and all this stuff, they typically will give you an opportunity to ask questions that you may have. A question that you should not ask is, how much do we get paid? How much do we get paid an hour? Or what's our salary? What are we expected to make? Don't ask that. I'm not saying don't ask it, but don't ask it then. You haven't even been invited to training yet. If you get invited to training when all of this is said and done, and they haven't mentioned salary, then you could bring it up. And look, I understand that money and salary and how much you're getting paid or potentially going to be getting paid is important. And, just some insight, your pay does increase, okay? Generally year by year, you'll get a raise. The pay does get better. But if you are expecting to make bukus of money when you first start out, it ain't gonna happen. So when I went to my first flight attendant interview, which was an open house, one of the things that the recruiters there asked us to do, each and every one of us to do, was to go up to the front of the room and tell everyone, why do you want to be a flight attendant? The mistake that I saw people making was they went up there and people were saying the same thing. They would say, well, I love to travel, I love to try, I love to fly, and I want to see the world, and I want an exciting career, and I'm tired of where I work right now, and I just need a change. And you just have to keep in mind, these recruiters, and they hear a lot of the same, and that's not what you want. You want something different. I'm not saying that by chance someone out there may not have said what you said, but you definitely don't want to be just another person out of 100 other people who said the same thing. That's another thing. When you are responding to that question, don't let your answer or your response be something too glamorized or too much of like a dream. There has to be more than just, it's my dream, and I love to fly, and I love to travel. So as people were going up to answer this question or these questions in front of everybody, a mistake that people made was they were not vocally projecting. And, you can't just be like, well, I really want to be a flight attendant because, no. The person in the very back row isn't going to hear that. So you have to be confident. You have to go up there, be confident with your shoulders back, wear a smile on your face. I'm not saying be fake and like, I just love this opportunity. I'm not, make eye contact with people. Look to the back of the room or the person in the last row. Look to the person there on the left and the right. Don't look down and, like you're shy. I'm not exactly an extrovert, and you don't have to be. But you do have to know that this is what I want to do, and I'm going to do what I can while I have the chance and show these people that I really want to be here. Because you could beat someone out just based upon how you go up there and how you're able to project your voice and smile and not give like the cookie cutter typical answers and responses. That is going to work in your favor. There's a difference between being confident and being arrogant. Because if you think that, the way I'm going to nail this interview is if I go up there and brag about me being a flight attendant before, I've been a flight attendant before, and I've had management experience, and I've had this and that, and blah, 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 and you're going down all of your qualifications. People can tell if you're being like braggadocious. And I'm not saying that you can't mention that, I used to be a manager or anything like that, or I used to do this, or I used to be a nurse or whatever. But like I said, people can tell when you are full of yourself and when you're just mentioning something that happens to apply to the question at hand. You get a chance to sit down with a recruiter or an interviewer, and they ask you, what would you say is a weakness of yours? So this is one of those times where it's not about lying. One of the worst things you could say in that kind of situation is like, my weakness is just that I can get frustrated really easily, especially if somebody is rude or somebody who doesn't have manners. That's a pet peeve of mine. That's a weakness of mine that I need to work on. Wrong. Like, again, I'm not saying to lie, because that might be the truth. But this is the time, like I said, to be politically correct. And there is no such thing as a weakness. The kind of thing I'm talking about is, well, I really don't see this as a weakness, but I've been told that, I work too hard. So it's not something I would say is necessarily a weakness, but, some people have said that I need to just know when to stop. That's, how you answer a question like that. Not, my weakness is my temper, or when people don't use manners, or, no, eliminated. No, I'm not laughing at being eliminated, but you're not going to help yourself if that's how you answer a type of question like that. All right, so now I'm going to start to talk about some mistakes that I made during my interview process or interview processes. So one of the mistakes that I made was, I kind of talked negatively about a former employer. And, I didn't think it was negative at the time, but, the recruiter had asked me, well, what happened with this particular job? Why did you leave? And I told her why. I started going into detail what happened. I wasn't speaking in the most positive tone about, the former employer. I still kind of was hurt and still had some emotion. So I think when the recruiters saw this, they were like, oh, okay. You have to be more diplomatic or politically correct with your answers. Along with that, don't give too much information away. I'm not saying to give short little answers, but try to make it brief. Give the facts, give the important information. Don't give a story. So on the second interview that I had with a totally different airline, one of the mistakes that I made was not being sociable, or as sociable as I could have been. There was a part of the interview where, the candidates were allowed to kind of socialize with each other, and the recruiters were kind of lined up around the wall or the room, and they were just kind of scoping things out. I didn't realize what was going on maybe until halfway of this, of that particular test was, oh, they were trying to see how sociable we are. And, one thing that if I could have done then, this is what I would have done. I would have gone up to as many of the candidates as I could have and just introduce myself to them, get their name, where they're from, tell them where I'm from, what did you used to do, this is what I used to do, and, move on to another person, even if it's a group. But don't just talk to one person, which that is something that I did. They want to see you work the room. So that was a mistake that I made. The same airline in the same interview, another mistake that I made was when I was having like a 2-person interview. And one of the things that they asked me was, what is the most important job or task of a flight attendant? Something to that effect. And I said something that had to do with customer service is what's important, and, being friendly, being kind, and all these things, which, yes, that's true, but I think that's where I made a mistake, because it wasn't until some time had passed and that I had been invited to my third and final flight attendant interview that I was like, let me read about flight attendants. And so I did. And one of the things that I noticed was that a lot of the first women who were flight attendants were kind of recruited from being nurses. They were formerly nurses and then they became flight attendants. And I was like, oh, it all started coming together. And so it's not just about customer service and you being able to provide that. It's about, number one, it's about safety or security. All right, so I'm going to leave y'all with that. But, if anything, just let this video serve as an encouragement to you. Like these interviews that I had happened like ever since 2010. And then I think I had another interview in 2011. And then my final interview in 2012. Before I got invited to training and then graduated, and now I'm doing it, living the dream. But if anything, please understand that I didn't stop. And, regardless of what had happened in the first interview that I ever had or the second one, I could have let that defeat me. I took those interviews and things that I was like, well, you know what, maybe I did this wrong. Or maybe, I could have answered that question better. And I was able to look back on those interviews and learn from mistakes that I made. But don't treat it as though it's the end of the world if you don't get past, your first ever interview. So, if that's what I thought, or if I told myself that, I wouldn't be able to sit in front of this camera as a current flight attendant now and make this video. And I always say at the end of my videos, peace, respect, and take care. Mwah.